We started the last time in our discussion how to, let us say, write off or prorate the different variances that we have recognized according to our accounting information system. Of course, as we said the last time, that the spending variances, the efficiency variances, and the price or rate variances for the direct and indirect costs should be, if immaterial, written off to the cost of goods sold, and if material, we need to answer another question. We need to use another criterion. Therefore, if the variance is material, we need now to consider whether this variance was within the control of the management or out of the control of the management. Therefore, if the variance was material and it was within the control of the organization or within the control of the management itself, therefore this variance would be because of some inefficiencies in the management, some inefficiencies in our processes, some inefficiencies in our activities. Therefore, we need not to carry these inefficiencies from one period to another. Therefore, we need to write it off to the cost of goods sold. Therefore, if it is material and within the control of the organization or within the control of, let us say, the management, we need to write it off directly to the cost of goods sold. But on the other hand, if the variance is material, but this variance is not within the control of the organization, it is not within the control of the management, therefore we need to prorate this variance to the different accounts, which is the work in process account, the finished goods account, and of course the cost of goods sold account. This is the same criterions, this is the same discussion, this is the same rationale we talked about and discussed in Cost Accounting 1 when we talked about and discussed the under allocation and the over allocation of costs. It is the same thing as the under or the proration or the writing off of the under allocation and the over allocation. Now let us consider something new, which is the production volume variance. Of course, we started our discussion the last time with the production volume variance, and we said that the production volume variance is because of not having or not producing the same output as planned. And as we can see from our example, the production volume variance was an unfavorable variance because we produced 2,000 units less than planned. We produced 10,000, the actual output was 10,000, while as we planned according to 12,000. Therefore, in this case, we had an unfavorable production volume variance. We said that this production volume variance means that we were not able to use the whole capacity that we are paying for. I am paying $276,000 in order to have the ability to produce 12,000 units. But I only used a part of this or a portion of this capacity in order to produce 10,000. Therefore, one rationale would say, or some of the accountants and management accountants would say, we need to write off this variance immediately to the cost of goods sold, and we need not to prorate this amount onto the different accounts. Why? Because as we said, that the 10,000 units that were produced actually should not be blamed by the cost of the unused capacity. Therefore, it should be written off, not prorated. But there is another way of thinking. There is another perspective. What if the capacity was used in full, but according to a different design or according to a different, let us say, manufacturing process, we used up the whole capacity in order to produce only 10,000 units. In this case, the whole amount of $276,000, which is the cost of the capacity, should be blamed on the 10,000 units as a whole. Therefore, in this case, the production volume variance should be prorated onto the different accounts. Why? Because the $276,000 in total was to support the production of the 10,000 units. Therefore, as you can see, we are taking another perspective from the perspective that we just discussed. Therefore, in this case, instead of writing off to the cost of goods sold, we need to prorate onto the different accounts. Another perspective that could be considered also, what if we had a favorable production volume variance? When can we get a favorable production volume variance? When do you think a production volume variance could be favorable? Excellent. Excellent. When we produce more products than planned. If, for instance, our plan or our planned capacity was 12,000 units, and we are paying 276,000 according to the 12,000 units, or in order to have a capacity to produce 12,000 units. But what if, also because of some design issues or some of efficiencies within the manufacturing process, we were able to produce more than the 12,000 units? Therefore, also the $276,000 were incurred in order to support the production of these units. For instance, let us say that we produced 13,000 units. Therefore, the 276,000 should be prorated, should be divided on the 13,000 units that were produced, correct? Therefore, this amount of costs supported the production of the 13,000 units. Therefore, it should be prorated, it should be divided on these 13,000 units. Therefore, as we can see here, one perspective or one rationale would say write it off to the cost of goods sold, and they have a point in that. And another rationale would say no, we need to prorate, not write it off to the cost of goods sold, and they are also right. On the other hand also, if we always use the writing off to the cost of goods sold method, that means we are giving the management a method or a way in order to manipulate earnings. Because writing off to the cost of goods sold would either increase or decrease cost of goods sold, which would most definitely affect our net income by an increase or a decrease. Therefore, we are giving them, or we are giving the management the ability to manipulate earnings, which is not a good thing. Therefore, as we can see here, we have more than one rationale, we have more than one perspective, and at the end we do not have a right answer and we do not have a wrong answer. We need to analyze the situation, and according to the situation we need to make a decision whether to write it off to the cost of goods sold or prorated to the different accounts that we have. Any questions? Of course, can you remember what was the entry that was used in order to prorate or write off the under allocation or the over allocation in cost accounting 1? Of course, as we took in cost accounting 1, the under allocation was debited. Yes, it was a normally debit balance. And the over allocation was normally a credit balance. Therefore, we need to, at the end of each period, we need to get rid of these accounts. We need to close these accounts. Therefore, the under allocation would be credited and the over allocation would be debited in order to close these accounts. If I'm going to write it off to the cost of goods sold, therefore we are going to debit or credit the cost of goods sold according to the under allocation or the over allocation. While as if we need to prorate it to the different accounts, we need to use the work in process account, we need to use the finished goods account and the cost of goods sold account. Of course, either it would be debited or credited according to the under allocation or the over allocation. The same would be here for our standard costing example or our standard costing method. The or let us say the unfavorable variances are debited, are normally debits, and the favorable variances are normally credits. Therefore, in order to close these accounts, we need to debit the favorable variances and we need to credit the unfavorable variances. And on the other hand, if we are going to write it off to the cost of goods sold, therefore we are going to debit or credit the cost of goods sold. If we are going to prorate it to the different accounts, we are going to debit or credit the work in process, the finished goods, and the cost of goods sold accounts. The same manner, the same criteria, or the same method that we took in cost accounting 1. Any questions? Of course, the last point in our chapter here, or in our discussion, is something called a for-variance analysis, which is presented here for the variable manufacturing overhead costs and the fixed manufacturing overhead costs. Of course, we said that the variable manufacturing overhead costs would have efficiency and spending variances, correct? While as the fixed manufacturing overhead costs would not or would never have an efficiency variance and also would have a spending variance. In addition, it would have a production volume variance. Now, I need to ask an important question. Do you think that a variable manufacturing overhead variance or a variable manufacturing overhead cost would have a production volume variance? Let us go back to the definition of the production volume variance. The production volume variance is the difference between what? Or is caused because of the difference between what? The actual quantity and the budgeted quantity or the planned quantity. Therefore, if we are planning to produce 12,000 units and we only produce 10,000 or we produce 13,000, we would have a production volume variance. Is this, or would we have a production volume variance if we are talking about the variable manufacturing overhead? Therefore, I'm asking, would it matter or would be there a difference between the allocated variable manufacturing overhead and the flexible budget amount? Is there a difference between the two in a variable manufacturing overhead? What do you think? No. Why no? You are correct. We will not have a difference between the allocated variable manufacturing overhead and the flexible budget amount. Why is that?
Is affected by the number of products produced. If we reduce the number of units.
Fixed manufacturing overhead variance analysis, we said that the production volume variance is because of considering or treating the fixed cost as variable, correct? This means that when we are going to allocate fixed manufacturing overhead on the amount or on the quantity of produced output, we are considering or we are treating this cost as a variable cost. This was the problem. While as in variable manufacturing overhead, we do not have this problem. Why? Because this cost is variable. We are treating this cost as variable and this cost is actually variable. Therefore, we do not have any problems. Therefore, according to our flexible budget amount that is calculated for the variable manufacturing overhead, we would multiply the standard quantity of the allocation base for the actual output multiplied by the standard rate. And when we allocate the variable manufacturing overhead, we would also multiply the standard quantity for the actual output multiplied by the standard rate. Therefore, we would not have any differences here. But when we consider the fixed expenses or the fixed manufacturing overhead expenses or costs, there is a difference. Why? Because we are allocating according to $57.5 per machine hour or per number of units of the allocation base, while on the actual side, the flexible budget would show the 276,000 regardless of the number of units sold or number of units produced. Why? Because according to our definition of fixed expenses, these expenses would stay the same regardless of the number of units produced and sold. Correct? Therefore, we said when we calculated or when we prepared our flexible budget, we said that the amount of fixed manufacturing overhead in the flexible budget would equal the amount in the static budget. Why? Because the number of units that is produced, or the change in the number of units that is produced from the static budget and the flexible budget would not affect our fixed costs. But when we consider the allocation of these costs, we are treating these costs as if they are variable, and they are not. Therefore, this problem is not, or it is not caused within the variable manufacturing overhead cost. Therefore, variable manufacturing overhead costs will never have a production volume variance, because the allocated amount would equal the flexible budget amount. On the other hand, the fixed manufacturing overhead costs would have a production volume variance, because the allocated amount would most definitely be different than the flexible budget amount. Of course, the fixed manufacturing overhead costs and expenses would never have an efficiency variance, because we said that the difference between the quantities from or the actual and the budgeted quantity would not have an effect on our fixed expenses. Therefore, we would not have an efficiency variance. A four variance analysis is an analysis. Of course, we took our variance analysis for the variable manufacturing overhead and for the fixed manufacturing overhead. Now, the four variance analysis considers all the variances, whether they are efficiency, they are spending, or production volume variance for the variable manufacturing overhead and the fixed manufacturing overhead. Therefore, in a four variance analysis, we present the variances and we present the efficiency variance that is never a variance for the fixed manufacturing overhead, and we also present the production volume variance, which is a never a variance for the variable manufacturing overhead. This is the meaning of a four variance analysis. As we can see here, this is the whole bunch of variances that could be or could not be within the variable manufacturing overhead and the fixed manufacturing overhead. Any questions? By this, we are finished from chapter number 8. And we are going to start solving problems in chapter number 8, starting by problem 829. Problem 829.
Kitchen-wise manufacturers premium food processors. The following is some manufacturing overhead data for Kitchen-wise for the year ended December 31, 2020. Manufacturing overhead variables are fixed. Budgeted number of output units 999.
The budgeted
89.
number of units 889. Yes.
Land allocation rate
888. Yes.
Land allocation rate 2 machine hour daily variant.
Planned allocation rate 2 machine hours per unit. Therefore, from this piece of information, I would deduct that or I would deduce, sorry, that the machine hours is the allocation base that we are going to use. Because as we are going to see, there is no direct information that would say that the machine hours is our allocation rate, but according to this piece of information, I would deduce that the machine hours is the allocation rate. Yes?
Actual number of machine hours used, 1,825.
Actual number of machine hours used, 1,024.
Static budget variable manufacturing overhead cost, 71,000.
Static budget
Variable
manufacturing overhead costs,
71,040.
$71,040.
Compute the following quantities. You should be able to do so in the described order. One budgeted number of machine hours is blank.
They only gave us these piece of information. Give me please the number of variable and fixed.
The actual results are variable.
Actual results. Therefore, we need to for the variable.
76,000.
Yes.
608.
608.
Flexible budget. 7,600.
800.
Allocated amount 76,800.
Without you saying, always, as we just said, always, according to our variable manufacturing overhead, the allocated would equal the flexible budget amount. It is always this way. Why? Because how did we get the flexible budget amount? We multiplied the standard quantity of the allocation base for the actual output by the standard rate, correct? Which is the same calculation for the allocation of the variable manufacturing overhead. Now for the fixed,
Actual result 350,208.
the flexible budget
348,069.
96. Yes. 96. Yes.
376.
376. 320. Therefore, according to this information, they need us to calculate some of the numbers or some of the information that could be used in our variance analysis. Therefore, number one, what is required? Budgeted number of machine hours planned. So what do you think, or how we are going to calculate the budgeted number of machine hours planned?
Actual number of units, two machine hours.
Excellent, but not by using the actual number. Excellent. Budgeted number, yes. If they say planned, they mean according to our static budget, according to our standard. And when they say budgeted number of machine hours, they are talking about the standard machine hours. Therefore, we are going to use the standard or the static number of units, and we are going to use the standard machine hour per unit. Therefore, they said that the budgeted number of units or the planned number of units is 888. multiplied, of course, by this piece of information. The planned allocation rate is 2 machine hours per unit. Therefore, each unit would use up a standard 2 machine hours. Therefore, multiplied by 2. It would be 1,776 machine hours. Therefore, we need 1,776 machine hours or standard machine hours in order to produce a budgeted or planned 888 number of units, or 888 units. Any questions? Number 2.
Budgeted fixed manufacturing overhead cost per machine hour.
Therefore, they need the budgeted fixed manufacturing overhead per machine hour. This means we need to calculate the budgeted allocation rate. Excellent. Therefore, how we are going to calculate the budgeted allocation rate? By dividing the fixed manufacturing overhead cost pool by the number of the allocation base, or the total number of units of the allocation base. Correct? Therefore, and of course they said that they need the budgeted fixed manufacturing overhead cost per machine hour. Therefore, the budgeted or the standard rate is the division of the standard fixed manufacturing overhead cost by the standard number of units of the allocation base. Because as we said, or as we took in cost accounting 1, we calculate the rates before the beginning of the year. Therefore, we are going always to use the standard costs and the standard number of units of the allocation base, or the planned according to our static budget. Therefore, the fixed manufacturing overhead, which is planned, is according to our static budget. What is the amount of fixed manufacturing overhead that is planned according to our static budget? 376, 320. This amount is the amount that is allocated. It is not the amount according to our static budget. 348,096. But as we can see, this amount is within the flexible budget, not the static budget. No. We said that the amount of fixed manufacturing overhead within the flexible budget would always be the same as the amount presented in the static budget, correct or not? Therefore, this amount that is presented in the flexible budget is the same amount that would be presented in the static budget. Therefore, the 348,096 is the planned cost pool for the fixed manufacturing overhead. Therefore, we are going to use the 348,096, of course, divided by the standard total number of units of the allocation base that we just calculated. Because according to our static budget, we are going to produce 888. And according to our standards, we need 2 machine hours in order to produce 1 unit. Therefore, we need 1,776, which is the total number of machine hours, which is the total number of the allocation base. Therefore, 1,776 would equal $196 per machine hour. Number 3. Therefore, the budgeted variable manufacturing overhead cost per machine hour. Therefore, this is the rate for the variable expenses. We calculated the rate or the budgeted rate for the fixed. Now we are going to calculate the budgeted rate for the variable. Therefore, we also need the variable manufacturing overhead cost pool divided by the total number of units of the allocation base. So what do you think the variable manufacturing overhead cost pool would be? 76,000. Of course, we said always that the rates, whether it is for the fixed manufacturing overhead or the variable manufacturing overhead, if we are considering the budgeted rates, needs to be calculated before the beginning of the period. Therefore, we are going to use the amounts that are presented within our static budget. If we use the 76,800, this is not the static budget amount. This amount is according to the actual output, but we need to consider what we have planned before the beginning of the period. Therefore, we need the static budget amount. Of course, this would not be as easy as the fixed manufacturing overhead. Why? Because the fixed manufacturing overhead amount in the static and the flexible budget would be the same. Therefore, we need the amount that would be presented in the static budget, and they gave us this amount. As you can see here, they gave us a piece of information. The static budget variable manufacturing overhead cost is 71,040. Therefore, we are going to use this number. Therefore, 71,040 divided by, of course, the total number of units of the allocation base, which is also the 1,776, which will equal $40 per machine hour. Any questions? Number 4, please.
Budgeted number of machine hours allowed for actual output to produce.
Therefore, number 4, we need to calculate the budgeted number of machine hours allowed for actual output. How do you think we could calculate this amount? The budgeted number of machine hours. Of course, when they say the budgeted number of machine hours, therefore we are going to use the standard machine hours. But for the actual number of units produced, is this term familiar? How do we prepare the flexible budget? The flexible budget is concerned with standard prices, is concerned with standard rates, is concerned with standard quantities, but using the actual number of units produced, correct? Therefore, in order to calculate or in order to present the budgeted number of machine hours allowed for the actual output, we need to consider the flexible budget amount. As we can see here, how do we calculate the flexible budget? For the variable, it is the standard quantity for the actual output multiplied by the standard rate. Therefore, do we know the standard rate?
Yes.
What is the standard rate? Yes, we have just calculated it. Yes, it is $40 per machine hour. Therefore, I know the amount, which is 76,800. I know the rate. The only thing that is missing, the only thing that we need to calculate is the standard quantity. Therefore, the budgeted number of machine hours allowed for actual output would equal the $76,800 divided by the $40 per machine hour, which would equal 1,920 machine hours. Therefore, I need to ask, the 1,920, would it be according to the standard or according to the actual number of machine hours? According to our standard. Therefore, the 1,920 are standard machine hours to produce an actual number of units. Of course, until now we do not know the actual number of units. But now I know that I need 1,920 machine hours in order to produce some number of the units. Any questions? Therefore now, number 5. Therefore, the actual number of output, of course in units. So what do you think, or how do you think we can calculate the actual number of output? We need to calculate the actual number of units that were produced. And we just said that the flexible budget amount is concerned with that. It means that the 1,920 machine hours is the standard machine hours to produce this amount, to produce this number of actual output, correct? Therefore, what is the standard machine hour per unit? Yes.
budgeted number of machine hour تقسيم الالوكيشن اللي هي الماشين hour يعني number of machine hour. اثنين. Excellent,
excellent, excellent. Therefore, the 1,920 is concerned with the standard quantity. Therefore, as we can see here, it is the standard quantity multiplied by the standard rate, correct? How did we get the standard quantity? According to our flexible budget, we multiplied the standard machine hour per unit, which is 2, by the number of units. It gave us the 1,920. Therefore, in order to know the actual output, I would divide the 1,920 machine hours by the 2 standard machine hours to produce 1 unit of the output. Therefore, the actual number of output units would be 1,920 machine hours divided by 2. It would equal 960 units. Any questions? Do you have any questions? Yes? Number 6, please. The actual number of machine hours used per output unit. Therefore, we need to calculate how much machine hours were used up to produce 1 unit of the 960 units, correct? Therefore, they gave us a piece of information that we used actual number of machine hours by the amount of 1,824, correct? Yes. And the 1,824 machine hours were used to calculate, were used to produce 960 units, correct? Therefore, it would be 1.9 machine hours per unit. This, of course, is an actual amount, not a standard amount. Of course, by this we have finished for today. Inshallah, we are going to continue the next time with also solving some of the problems after moving on to the next chapter. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you the next time, inshallah.